Today we're going to start working with Photoshop and modifying some of the images that you might want to use for your poster. If you haven't already, go ahead and launch Photoshop until you see this screen, and then go to the Create New icon. For this tutorial, what I want you to do is to, every time I ask you to take a note for a keyboard shortcut, I want you to go ahead and write that down, and that's what you're going to be turning in at the end of this tutorial. So let's go ahead and create the new Photoshop document. And right away you'll see something that looks familiar with Illustrator. You'll see probably inches here, and you'll see pixels per inch. In Photoshop, a lot of times you're going to be working with something called a pixel, which is different from Illustrator, where we work with vectors. So a pixel is like a little dot of color on the screen, and usually documents and photographs are made up of millions of these little dots of color. And you can see if I select something that's 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, that'll be 1,000,000 pixels altogether, and that's a grid with 1,000,000 little dots of color that from far away looks a little bit like a photograph. To get started, let's go ahead and make a document that's similar to the document you will be needing. So we know that our width is going to be 11, but with the 1/4 inch bleed, it's going to be 11.5, because a 1/4 inch bleed on both sides. We're going to go ahead and put that in here as well. And then the height we're going to need is 17, but 17.5 with that 1/4 inch bleed. The resolution we already know is 300, and if you add all these numbers up, if we change this to pixels, we'll see that that's actually 3,450 pixels by 5,000 pixels worth of data that we're going to be manipulating. So hopefully your computer is strong enough. This is a pretty typical size for a poster that's 11 by 17. We're going to hit Create, and right away you're going to see a screen that looks similar to hopefully mine, and somewhat to Illustrator. If it doesn't look similar to mine, go ahead and go to Workspace, Windows Workspace, and change it to Essentials Default, or reset your Essentials, and that will reset all your setups here. On the left hand side, you'll see a docked ruler, as you can kind of see here, or a docked toolbar, and in that toolbar are a lot of different things that if you just kind of put your mouse over it, you'll see what some of those things do. Some of those are familiar, some of them are not. By default, you will be at the top Move tool, which is very similar to the selection tool in Illustrator. So that's the tool that we're going to be on, kind of like situated on the most. There's a menu at the top bar. Every tool is case sensitive, so when you click on a tool, you'll see the top bar here changing based on what that tool can give you. So this clone stamp tool or this paintbrush tool will give you different paintbrush options. So we'll go back to the Move tool. On your right hand side, you'll see a bunch of tabs that are open. You know that if you went to Windows and opened up a tab, go ahead and open up the Properties tab. That'll open up tabs that you don't see. You can take this Properties tab and dock it, and we're going to dock it here in this Learn window and let go, and you can move it to the front just by doing that. This Properties tab is not as used as much as it is in Illustrator, because in Illustrator a lot of the things are dynamic, and in Photoshop we'll be working with the Layers palette, which is why it's front and center at the bottom. Currently, you see you have a locked layer that's called background. And notice how you don't have a layer hierarchy here. This is not a layers folder that has been created. It's just a straight layer inside of the layers palette. So let's get started by bringing something into this workspace. We're going to go to File and Place Embedded. And the difference between linking and embedding something is that if we link something via Place, it'll leave the thing on the desktop, and so when you send this file to somebody, it won't be in the file, and things will be lost. So if you're going to do Place, do make sure it's Place Embedded, and we're going to go ahead and look for the Photoshop Images folder that I've uploaded, and I want you to select number 1 and hit Place. You'll notice right away that it just places it with an X. At this point, you need to scale this image. So it's very similar to Illustrator in that way. So you'll also notice that if you do not hold the Shift key down, it actually by default scales without that, by constraining the proportion. In Illustrator, you would have to hold the Shift key down. If you hold the Shift key down, of course, it does just the opposite. So that's kind of an issue. I'm going to undo that. And I'm not going to hold the Shift key down, but I'm going to expand this so that it more than fills up the screen. And notice how you can see the outside boundaries here. And then when you're happy with what you see, I want you to hit the Return key, and that sets the size for this. So I want you to notice that we've created a new layer. It has the name of the layer being the name of the image, which is number 1. And it has this funny little symbol down here. This is a smart layer. And if you notice the Properties tab here, it says Embedded Smart Object. For this class, for this introductory class, we are not going to work with smart objects. I'm going to show you why. I'm going to go back to my Move tool because it jumped to Crop here. And I'm going to double click this smart object in my Layers window. And I want you to watch what happens with my tabs here. If I double click this, you'll notice that it opens up in a brand new window, and that window has all the properties associated with that linked file, that smart object. Smart objects are not actually in the document. They're actually links to the document. So what you need to do in order to modify them is modify the smart object. Because that's kind of like going to be a lot of work to keep jumping back and forth and back and forth, I'm going to close this tab using this little button and go back to our original Photoshop layout here. And what I'm going to do is right click or control click onto the actual thumbnail icon. You can kind of see if I don't do it right, if I do it on the icon, and if I do it on the number, I get this selection here. What I want you to do is rasterize this layer. So we've seen that in Illustrator as well, and that actually just turns the layer into a bunch of pixels, and it will remove the Smart Object tab here. So that is your first note for today, is to how do you get a layer to be a rasterized layer, not a smart object. So please make a note. There is one more thing you can add to this note. I'm going to undo, and if you go to this little hamburger tab thing here, you can see that you can also get to that rasterized layer as well. Let's see. I should be selecting it, and let's see, it's probably eluding me here. Maybe it's not available here. Convert to smart. Convert to layers. I guess that's the word that we're looking for. Convert to layer. And that will rasterize that layer. Honestly, I find it easier just to control click on the actual number itself, or the word for that, and then actually convert to rasterize that layer. So once it's rasterized, you will see it looks like a normal layer now without any little marks on it. You can actually click once into the number here, and then you can change the name of it. Change this name to Leaves. And now we've modified this layer so that we know what's going on. It's similar to Illustrator in that way. All right, the next thing we're going to do is talk about zooming. And zooming in and out is really important to see what you're doing. Just similar to Illustrator, we will use the Command plus key to zoom in. And you can see you can keep zooming. You'll notice the percentage zoomed at the bottom left-hand corner. If you zoom out to 100%, these are 100% pure pixels that we're seeing. So Command plus and Command minus are your second notes that you need to set and send to me here. The third thing on your notes should be how do you pan around. And if you hold the spacebar key, you'll notice that you can now pan around the object, move around, and you see it looks a little different than in Illustrator. So spacebar is the third note that you want to actually include. And then finally, for the fourth note, Command 0 zeroes you out to see the entire panel from top to bottom. So that's always a great thing if you're zoomed in. Command plus plus plus, and you want to just see how what you've done is affecting the rest of the document. Command 0 jumps you back, and that's the fourth number that I'd like you guys to take down, or the fourth note. So those are some keyboard shortcuts on moving around in the document. Obviously you could do that here as well, and if you have a trackpad, you can use a trackpad to move around. as well. Okay, the next thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at our layers palette. And what I'm going to have you do with this not normal layer is I'm going to have you duplicate. There's a couple of ways to duplicate this layer so that we can keep this one as the original and then work with our duplicates. So one way to duplicate it is to just select it by clicking on it and hitting this plus button. Undo that. I'm sorry. By dragging it to this plus button, and that will duplicate that layer, as you can kind of see. It'll call it leaves copy, but what I want you to call it is leaves black and white. So duplicating the layer, one way to do it is to drag it onto this little plus icon next to the trash can. Obviously, the trash can will probably delete the layer. Now we have 3 layers altogether: our background layer, our leaves layer, and our leaves white layer. And you'll notice that none of these things happen to show up because this layer right here is completely opaque, right? There's 100% opacity. That means I'm going to select my move tool and just move that layer to the left, and you can see that that layer is you can kind of see that that layer on top here is the one I'm moving. Now if you select the middle layer and move things around, you'll notice that things do move. Something is happening, but you're not seeing what's happening because this top layer is occluding what you're doing. So make sure, I'm going to undo that, that you're always on the layer that you can see and it's selected if you're doing something to it. Okay, so number 5 was duplicating a layer. Now, normally you can just drag it onto this plus icon, but when you get hundreds of layers, which you might, a fast way to duplicate a layer is to use the keyboard shortcut Command J. So I'm going to jump to my leaves layer, the original one, and then Command J, and that jumps that layer to a new layer as a copy. And this will be useful for a lot of things. So go ahead and name this leaves layer leaves brightness contrast. Okay, so let's start by jumping to the top layer, our leaves black and white layer. By the way, note number 5 was duplicating a layer, Command J, or using the little duplicate layer button. Okay, whatever we're going to do at this point is going to affect the top layer, and the rest of the layers we really can't see anyway. So let's go to Image, Adjustments, and because we called this black and white, we're going to select the black and white adjustment layer or adjustment filter first. So when we do that, we'll get this this giant selector here, and what this does, I'm going to uncheck this preview so you can see what we had originally. Notice how we have red leaves, yellow leaves, and a little bit of green here as well, and then some gray. I'm going to hit the preview button. If I wanted to take all the red leaves and make them black, I would move this slider down, and you'll notice that that says everything that is red, map it to this color black, right? So you can kind of see what this allows, or you could do just the opposite. You can brighten up all these leaves as well, and notice how it really just dials in to that specific leaf. Notice that my cursor icon is a little eyedropper tool. If you click on the eyedropper, it tells you what's underneath what you're working on. So for instance, if I went to preview and I click this red, oh, here are some presets. Never mind, it doesn't seem to be working here. I'm going to go back to preview. Now you can hit the auto button, and that'll kind of like give you a nice overall black and white feel, kind of adjust some of these things. And you can try some of the presets, like for instance, there's an infrared preset, and that kind of like makes it look like it's an infrared thing. Or you can dial in these things to your heart's content. And notice like there was that little bit of green here. You could really pop that green by pulling up the cyan and magenta and maybe making everything else super dark. So this is going to be dependent on the photograph, and this gives you a lot of options to figure out like how you want to tint this as far as the black and white is concerned. Like how do you want to modify these blues or yellows? And this, as you can see, this image doesn't have a lot of blues, and so when you move this slider up and down, not a lot of things will happen, but the red definitely has there is a lot of red in there, as you can kind of see. Another thing you can do is hit the tint button, and that'll allow you to tint this photograph, and you can increase the amount of saturation or decrease it based on that tint as well. So those are some examples of black and white. So go ahead and select, I'm just going to use my red filter, and I'm going to dial it down, and I'm going to hit OK. And what I've done now is permanently modify this layer so that it is black and white. So that's the first thing. That's why we've been making duplicates, is to make sure that that layer itself doesn't get, this original one doesn't get destroyed. Okay, we're going to turn this layer off by using the little eye icon, and notice now it went away. It's still there. You can just turn it on and off. And I'm going to jump to this new layer that I have brightness contrast, and sure enough, we're going to go to Image, Adjustment, and then we're going to select brightness contrast. Now this will be number 5 or 6, I think we're on right now, of your notes. Image, adjust, and then these are all the adjustments that are possible. So we're going to go to the next most common adjustment layer, which is the brightness contrast, and you'll see you can actually decrease the brightness of the image or decrease or increase the contrast. So this is a really nice slider just to be able to do that. Your phones have it, but it's also important to know where it's located in Photoshop. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to turn that layer off. We're going to go back to the original leaves layer and jump it, Command J, to a new layer, and we're going to go to Image, Adjustment. We're going to use Vibrance, and at this point you'll see that this actually really pops the colors that are in the image, as you can see here. The Vibrance slider is always going to give you something that's a little more subtle, whereas the saturation slider will go over the top. So you can kind of see this almost is too bright, too crazy. So Vibrance is used like when there's people involved. It'll just really pop the colors without destroying the photograph. And then the saturation slider is if you really want to make this look like something from a candy shop. Once you're happy with what you see, hit OK, and we can name that that layer saturation, sat, and vibe. Let's turn it off so we can see before and after, right? And then let's go to the leaves layer. We're going to jump this. We're going to go to Image, Adjustment, and this time we're going to pick something that's called levels. Now, levels in Photoshop are used quite heavily, and here's how they work. You're going to get this dialogue and you're like, what does this mean? If you haven't seen levels before, what you're seeing is a histogram of the brightness for the various things here. Notice here there's this little area that's black. That black part is this amount here. So you can see that this image has a very little black, a lot of middle like grays and values that are just right in this like area. So this is this image, if this is the center point, tends to be on the darker side, and you can kind of see that it is on the darker side. And then there's a few whites you can kind of see, but right at the top you can see that there's almost no pure whites because you see how that little area is pulled down. So how this works is you are telling the image what to throw away and what to keep and what to balance with. So for instance, if I wanted to lighten up this image, currently it's dark because this is like this is the point where all the darkness is. If I were to say, hey, make this image centered here, you'll notice that it actually brightens up the image, and that's because we're saying that this is the middle gray, or the middle of the image gray. So you can actually move this middle slider around to brighten and darken the image based on what you see. So think of it like brightness contrast in that way. Now this slider on the end here remaps all the darkest pixels to be, so I'm going to move this up so you can see what's going on. I am telling everything below, all the information from here to the left, I want you to turn it to pure black, right? So this becomes this color. So, or at least really, really dark. And what you're doing here when you move these two sliders together is you're increasing the contrast. So I can actually just say, I'll throw a little bit of this part away, And then you can do the same with the white. You can pull that in. Everything to the right of this gets mapped to this color white. So you can kind of see this really blowing the image out, right? So it's in essence, increasing the contrast because these two things are closer together, and then all the things to the right of this are removed completely from the scene. So you can kind of see if I wanted to just increase the contrast for this this photo, I would be increasing it around where there's the most information, maybe around here. And you can see if I turn the preview on and off, it does in fact increase the contrast because these are closer together, and I'm throwing away this information and this information. So once I hit OK, that information is just not coming back. So for this layer, I want to call it levels. Levels is great because it really shows you what's going on visually with your image, and if you're missing colors, you can really bring them up. Okay, one last thing for this. I'm going to jump the original leaves, Command J, and you'll notice now that our area is starting to get pretty full. And I'm on this layer, and I'm going to go to Image, Adjustment, and then finally color balance, which is one of my favorites. And what it does is it actually will modify the hues for the different parts of the image, the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. So for instance, if we click on shadows and we increase the amount of magenta in the shadows, it's going to give the darker areas a more purpley feel. I'll even make this more obvious by just bringing this up, but the midtones themselves are not changed. So there's not as many midtones in this as we saw in the histogram for levels. But for instance, I can dial up the midtones, and you'll see that the purple shadows are still pretty visible in the dark areas, but the midtones are now way more yellow, as you can kind of see now it interacts. And the same with the highlight. You can actually say, okay, for the highlight, I want it to be a lot more cyan, and you can see now that the places that are really bright in this image have been given a bit of cyan that mixes with the midtones, and so gives you this this kind of yellowish area here because it's being mixed. But obviously in the gray areas, it's giving you the pure cyan that you're looking for here. Could even make it more obvious by adding a little bit of blue. So shadows, midtones, and highlights all could be dialed in, so you can get something that looks fairly interesting, especially when you add in like the shadow areas and you modify those. It gives the feeling of a little bit of a special effect. So yeah, color balance is the last image adjustment that I want you to play with. But you can see that once you've done that, I'm just going to name that color balance. Each one of these areas, or each one of these are actually kind of retain the properties that you've associated with those levels, or with those modifications or enhancements. Now, you can what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to compile all these things into a single location so that we can decide when we want to use these things. So what I want you to do is shift select all the layers, even the invisible ones, and what I want you to do then is click on this folder icon. Because we've selected those layers, it automatically grouped them into this folder, and I'm going to call this folder leaves. And inside of all inside of this folder is all those leaf images that you see here, right? And so when we collapse that folder, we could turn that folder completely off, and we're back to our original Photoshop document with our background layer that happens to be locked. So that'll be your final note for this portion of Photoshop, is to create a folder using the folder icon after shift selecting the images or things you want in that folder. If you, for whatever reason, want to remove things from the folder, you can always just drag them, and you should see this little blue icon that will tell you that that's taking that thing out of the folder. You can also drag things back into the folder just by dragging onto the folder itself. Okay, I'm going to turn that folder off, and we're going to stop it at this point.